Well, the Zags are involved in the Caleb Love sweepstakes. Let's discuss the pros and cons of adding the high scoring but inefficient former North Carolina Tar Heels guard right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Let's go.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Happy Memorial Day. Hopefully all of you had a great weekend and are finding a way to celebrate today, or depending when you're listening to it, I guess on Tuesday. We are talking all things Caleb Love today. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of adding Caleb Love. We're going to talk a little bit about the situation, how he got to the point that he is, the decommitment from Michigan, what happened there. We're going to lay all of that out, take a look at that as we, of course, continue to wait to find out what is happening with Anton Watson, with Malachi Smith, information we should have in the next couple of days as you're listening to this podcast. We're going to close out the show talking about Jerry Krause as well, a nearly incomparable figure in Gonzaga basketball and Eastern Washington basketball history. We're going to talk about him after his passing at the age of 87 over the weekend. But first, let's get into the Caleb Love conversation. For those who need a little bit of a catch-up, Caleb Love spent the last 3 seasons as a combo guard for the North Carolina Tar Heels. He's been a high-level scorer for them for the past 3 years. Career averages of 14.6 points, 3.3 boards, 3.3 assists. He's a career just under 40% shooter on twos, just on 2-pointers alone, and a career just under 32% from deep. So like we said, takes a lot of shots, scores a lot of points, isn't particularly efficient. He did wrap things up with a pretty solid season last year in 22-23. Obviously, North Carolina did not meet the expectations that many had for them. They were the preseason #1 team who did not make the NCAA tournament. That has never happened in the modern era of college basketball. Love was a factor in that, although his numbers were solid. 16.7 points per game last year. That's a career high 3.7 rebounds as well. Dropped down to 2.8 assists. He had 1.1 steals and 2.4 turnovers per game. His 45.5% on 2-pointers was a career high, so he was more efficient in the mid-range game, more efficient around the rim. However, his 3-point shooting dropped to 29.9%. That was also on 7.5 attempts per game. Whoo, man. So he has taken 7.5 threes per game and knocking them down barely, but still less than 30% of the time. Him and RJ Davis had a significant challenge trying to figure out how to play together last year. The two of them, Mondo Baycott in the front court, they had the talent, they had the pieces. It just didn't go together for Hubert Davis's team last year. The simplest way to describe Caleb Love, and this is a quote from my good friend and, of course, the host of the Locked On Tar Heels podcast and co-host with me of Locked On College Basketball, Isaac Shade, who basically said Caleb Love is more than capable of shooting teams into games and shooting them out of them. And I think that's what we saw from him last year at North Carolina. And I think that's why there is some concern among the Gonzaga fan base about the potential addition of Caleb Love. We'll talk pros and cons in the second segment, but the reason Caleb Love is even still available here in late May, as we record this on Memorial Day, is because of the Michigan admissions department. This is the second year in a row that this kind of story has happened. Love entered the transfer portal shortly after the season ended up committing to Michigan and spent, I think, at 6 weeks, I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head, but over a month committed to Michigan. There was a few rumblings that, hey, maybe something's going on here, but nothing significant. Love even kind of continued to say, I'm committed to Michigan. I'm blue and gold, man. I'm going to the Wolverines. Like, that's where I'm going to play next year. Unfortunately, that decision was not made by him. The Michigan's admissions department, which last year did not admit Terrence Shannon, who was trying to transfer there. He ended up transferring to Illinois, stayed in the Big Ten, had a really productive season for the Illini. It happened again. And look, there can be a much larger conversation to be had about what this means, timelines, things like that. Obviously, a player, there being a shortened window for a player to transfer to another school, and then something like this happening that pushes the player back out into the portal, something probably needs to change there. Michigan's admissions department is obviously, this has happened twice and it doesn't happen to a lot of our schools. I don't know how else to say that. I don't want to blame them because they have high standards for their institution, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but something needs to change. There needs to be some kind of give and take here, whether it's ensuring that this process is handled quicker so that a player doesn't spend an entire month assuming he's going to go somewhere for school and then find out he can't. Like, something about that situation needs to change. I'm not going to sit here and dig down on Michigan's admissions department. I know a lot of people are doing that. I don't know the full story. I've worked in higher education. I don't think that just blanketly blaming one department is probably not the full situation here and shouldn't be how we go about it. But it is unfortunate that this is how it happened twice to Juwan Howard in his program. And now puts a player like Caleb Love, who thought that he had his next at least season of his career mapped out, and now is kind of back out trying to figure out what he wants to do. Regardless, that leaves us in a situation now where Caleb Love is on the open market. He is available, and the schools that have been connected to him thus far since re-entering the portal and not going to Michigan, Gonzaga, of course, we'll talk about them, Texas, Arizona, Alabama, Indiana, Louisville, and UConn are the main schools that are being associated with Caleb Love at this moment. Mizzou is a school that recruited him out of high school. He's from St. Louis. They recruited him out of North Carolina. Not sure if they're still involved here. They've added 3 guards in the portal. They may have finally said, hey, you know what? If you rejected us twice, we're not going to go ahead and pursue it a third time. Hard to blame them there. I wonder if St. Louis, his hometown school in the A-10, if they have showed any interest here as well. I suspect Caleb Love's going to try to stay as a starter at the high major level. Hard to blame him when you started for a team that went to a national championship game. And in fact, you were a big reason that they went to the national championship game. Regardless, Caleb Love's got plenty of suitors. For Gonzaga, of course, Ryan Nembhard's already penciled in at the 1. You have Nolan Hickman likely starting at the 2. You have Dusty Stromer and Steele Venters in that guard room as well. And then the big question, what's going on with Malachi Smith? And we'll have an answer to that question very soon, potentially as soon as you're listening to this, if not within 48 hours of when you're listening to this, because that is when the deadline for Malachi Smith to make a decision on returning to school or staying in the NBA draft process, which for him would likely involve finding a place to play professionally overseas. I don't think he's going to be an NBA player. Maybe he gets a summer league invite. Maybe he gets a 2-way contract. Maybe, but more likely, I think his professional basketball career is going to happen somewhere other than the United States. But he still has the decision to make, because I'm going to tell you right now, make this very simple. Caleb Love is not coming to Gonzaga if Malachi Smith comes back. It's not happening. It's not really even worth discussing. We can have conversations about which one you'd rather have back, and I think that's more or less what we're going to do in the pro-cons conversation, but they're not both going to be here. It's just not going to happen. So for right now, the Caleb Love conversation at Gonzaga is kind of predicated on what happens with Malachi Smith. If Caleb Love is absolutely adamant that he wants to go to Gonzaga, I don't think that the Zags would push Malachi Smith out. I don't think that that's a situation that's going to arise. So I think it's more or less, okay, Malachi said he's out, so let's kind of get a little bit more aggressive about pursuing Love and figuring out whether that's going to work. Okay, Malachi's coming back. Let's just kind of turn our attention to Anton Watson, turn our attention to the front court, and maybe leave the Caleb Love thing to somebody else. I think that's kind of the situation that we're in right now. I don't see a reality where Love, Smith, Hickman, and Nembhard are all here. It just doesn't, it's just not going to work. You also have Steele Venters, you have Dusty Stromer. I just don't think that Caleb Love would make that decision to come to this school if Malachi Smith were to come back. So let's assume that Malachi Smith is leaving. And in the second segment, what I want to do is talk about the pros of adding Caleb Love in his place and that final guard spot, and the cons of making that same decision. All of that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious snack, but you don't want all of the sugar and calories, then you need the best tasting protein bar ever built. Built Bars are healthy and they taste amazing. Seriously, they taste so good, you will not think that they are healthy for you. What makes them so good? Well, for starters, they are covered in 100% real dark chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and cookies and cream. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. They only have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering Built bars at Built.com, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club, while you can still get your specialty flavors at Built.com. So head to your nearest Walmart today, walk up to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puff. And if you're close to a Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with our hit flavors, Brownie Batter Puff and Churro Puff. You can thank me later. Built Bar, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. For you everyday listeners, of course, the rest of the week is dedicated to Anton Watson and Malachi Smith. What it means if they come back, what it means if they don't come back, we'll have those announcements on Wednesday. We'll get into June. We'll continue to start looking at the NBA draft process, Julian Strother's workouts, Drew Timme's workouts, what it means for those two guys as we get closer and closer to the NBA draft. But for now, we're going to continue talking transfer portal because the Zags are connected to one of the biggest names currently in the transfer portal. That is Caleb Love. We talked about Caleb Love's history, his 3 years at North Carolina, his month or so foray at Michigan before unfortunately getting denied by the admissions department, his current availability and the teams that are pursuing him in the transfer portal for his second go-round. What I want to do here in the second segment is take a look at the pros and cons of adding Caleb Love. And we're doing this through the lens of a Gonzaga roster that does not include Malachi Smith because, as I said in the first segment, I do not believe that Caleb Love comes to Gonzaga with Malachi Smith, so I don't think spending time talking about a hypothetical roster with both of them is really worth your time as a listener. I don't think that we need to discuss that. If it happens, if that does become a reality, we will definitely have plenty of conversations about what that looks like. I didn't think Rasir Bolton and Malachi Smith would both be on Gonzaga's roster last year, and they were, so it is possible for that to happen. But for right now, we're talking pros, cons, Caleb Love on a roster for Gonzaga that does not include Malachi Smith. The pros for Caleb Love, simple. He is a high-level scorer. He scores the basketball as well as many, many, many people in college basketball. He would be the best scorer on Gonzaga's offense in the guard room as of now. Caleb Love would thrive in an up-tempo, fast-break offense. Gonzaga loves possessions. They love getting out in transition. They love going and going and going. And I think we're going to see a more of a return to that than we've seen in the last few years because we will not have Drew Timme, and I don't think that Drew Timme is nearly as bad of an athlete as people make him out to be, but there's no way to deny that Drew Timme had Gonzaga play more of a half-court offense than they have historically. That's just a fact. When you have the best low-post scorer in college basketball, you're going to play a half-court offense, you're going to get him the rock, you're going to let him do what he does. And do what he does led to him being the leading scorer in the school's history. So it clearly worked. But I think the new era of Gonzaga basketball, the post-Drew Timme era, if you'll indulge me on that, is going to be more fast-paced, more run and gun, more pick-and-roll based, a little bit more Nembhard-esque because we saw what Andrew Nembhard was capable of doing. And yes, that was in the Drew Timme era. But I think now we'll see more of that with Ryan Nembhard. Up-tempo, out in transition, spacing the floor, a lot of outside shooting, a lot of driving to the basket, that kind of thing. And if that's the offense that Mark Few wants to run, if that's the offense we're going to see from Gonzaga post-Drew Timme, Caleb Love fits really well. He spaces the floor. He's a high-level athlete. He gets out in transition. He can score around the rim. He stretches the defense like we said. Look, he's not a very consistent three-point shooter, but to stretch the defense at the college level, you don't necessarily need to be an elite three-point shooter. You just need to be a willing three-point shooter. There's been tons of data about this of like, you don't need to be opposing defenders are not saying, okay, this guy only shoots 32%, so we're going to pack it. Like, that's not how they operate. If you're willing to shoot threes, you space the defense because they know, hey, this guy's a shooter. They don't call him a maker. They call him a shooter. He's a shooter. So we're going to play tighter defense on him. That opens up more of the middle. So Graham Ike's got more room to operate down low. Anton Watson's got more room to operate down low, assuming he comes back. Ben Gregg, more room to operate down low. You put Caleb Love and Steel Venters on the wings with Ryan Nembhard running the point, or insert Nolan Hickman in either of those spots, it doesn't matter. All of those guys can shoot. All of those guys are 35+% three-point shooters, except Caleb Love. But he is a very willing three-point shooter. So he's still spacing the floor, just not as consistently knocking them down. The arrival of Caleb Love would put less pressure on Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman to score. Wouldn't necessarily put less pressure on them to perform. They still would have to be, the best versions of themselves for this Gonzaga team to reach their threshold, but they don't have to be 10, 12, 14, 16 point per game scorers. You bring in a guy who's probably going to average 14 to 16 per game in Caleb Love, suddenly your guard room can focus more on facilitating, distributing, playing better on defense, hitting open shots, that kind of stuff, but not like I need to go get this amount of buckets per game. Somebody like Caleb Love helps ease that pressure. Beyond that, the opposing team's best defensive player is probably going to guard Caleb Love. So that gives Ryan Nembhard more opportunities to maybe attack the second best perimeter defender on a WCC team is probably an advantage Ryan Nembhard. Same with Nolan Hickman. Same to an extent with Steele Venters, although his size makes it a little bit different because they'll probably match up with him in different ways. But Caleb Love's arrival would create a domino effect on opposing defenses, giving them one more difficult playmaker to have to defend, and that opens up opportunities for Nembhard, for Hickman. Or if the opposing team decides to put their best defensive player on Nembhard, that opens up opportunities for Caleb Love to potentially attack the basket and get buckets that way. Point is, we should see an uptick in efficiency for Caleb Love in the WCC. He is going to score more efficiently around the rim with rim protection from the WCC than in the ACC. He's probably going to get more open looks from three on an offense as dynamic and well-rounded as Gonzaga's against WCC opponents. Beyond that, Caleb Love is an 81.5% free throw shooter and a player with championship experience. Guard play wins in March. Experienced guard play wins in March. This is as close to a blueprint of success as you can find in college basketball. Nobody had San Diego State and UConn in the national championship game. I shouldn't say nobody, but very, very few people did. But guess what? San Diego State had multiple guards in their fourth or fifth year of eligibility. Matt Bradley was in his fifth year. Lamont Butler was in his fifth year. Darian Trammell was in his fourth year. UConn, Tristan Newton, been around for a long time. Jordan Hawkins was a couple years starter. That was an experienced guard room as well. Joey Calcaterra coming off the bench for UConn, sixth-year player at UConn. Of course, started his career at San Diego. Experienced guard play wins in March. Caleb Love has hit a huge shot to end the career of Duke coach Mike Krzyzewski when they beat Duke to advance to the Final Four. He played in a national championship game. He knocks down his free throws. Those are valuable things to have on a team in March. What are the cons of adding Caleb Love? Well, he's a bit of a ball hog. There's not really any other politer way to put it. He likes to shoot the basketball. He likes to take guys off the dribble. He likes to attack the basket. He doesn't have particularly great assist numbers. Caleb Love was a bit miscast as a combo guard, and I apologize if I called him that earlier. Caleb Love is a shooting guard. He's not really a combo guard. He doesn't really play the point. The Zags don't need a point guard. They got two of them in Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman. But Caleb Love is not somebody who's going to facilitate an offense. He's not going to break it down, find the open shooter. That's not really his goal. He's a shooter. He's a scorer. If Mark Few and Gonzaga can figure out how to acclimate him into this offense, great. But there is concern that that may not be very easy to do. Hubert Davis tried it with Caleb Love. They tried to have him be a combo guard who played a little bit on the ball, a little bit off the ball. It didn't work. It didn't work. I don't think Mark Few and the Zags are going to do that, but you are adding a player who has the, as Isaac said, as I said earlier in the show, has the ability to shoot you right out of a game. You may not want that on your team. You may not want a guy who's shooting 7.5 threes a game when he's knocking them down at 30%. I think his efficiency would probably tick up in the WCC, but there's still some efficiency concerns about Caleb Love. Beyond that, I think one of the concerns for Caleb Love is what it would do for Nolan Hickman. Right now, the potential starting lineup for the Zags has Ryan Nembhard at the 1, Nolan Hickman at the 2, Steele Venters at the 3, and then depending on whether Anton Watson returns, him and Graham Ike or Ben Gregg and Graham Ike starting at the front court. Caleb Love coming in. Caleb Love's not going to come off the bench. He's just not. He's not going to come off the bench. If he got an inkling that that's what Gonzaga was going to do, he would just go somewhere else. And I'm not really criticizing him for that. If he doesn't want to come off the bench, fine. Go somewhere where you don't have to come off the bench. That's totally fine. But if he was going to come to Gonzaga, it would be because he was promised a starting lineup spot. And if that was the case, that means that Nolan Hickman is moving back to the bench. Some of you are not going to see this as a con. From a basketball playing perspective, it may not be a con. A starting backcourt of Ryan Nembhard and Caleb Love is probably better than a starting backcourt of Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman. In part because they're more different as players, and I think that they're a little bit more dynamic. They're a little bit more difficult for opposing defenses to handle if you have Nembhard and Love on the floor at the same time. But I said this on a recent podcast, and I'll say it again. I do not remember a player starting every single game, and Nolan Hickman started every game. Yes, he did not start senior night, but I don't really count that. I don't remember an instance of a player starting every single game and then going back to the bench the next year. In Gonzaga's system, it's very rare. Does that mean it shouldn't happen? Not necessarily, but it could create problems. Whether it's stalling Nolan Hickman's development, he doesn't continue to improve as a basketball player the way that we hoped that he would. He took significant strides from year 1 to year 2. It would be unfortunate to not see him take those strides in year 3, but reverting back to the bench in a smaller role could cause that to happen. There's also the possibility of internal strife. And I don't want to say a single negative thing about Nolan Hickman's character because I have zero negative things to say about Nolan Hickman's character. He is an outstanding human being. But it would be frustrating to be assuming that you're going to be the starting point guard for year 3, to be told you're going to be the starting point guard. There's no way they haven't told him that he's planning to start next year. And then to see the team add 2 high-level point guards, or guards, I should say, in the transfer portal, and you revert back to the bench. It would be a shot to your confidence. It would make you feel like maybe the team doesn't have that kind of confidence or faith in you, and it could cause issues. Whether it's internal for Hickman, he just struggles because of this, whether it permeates other people in the team, whether it infects them from a recruiting perspective. Players are like, I don't want to go to that program because what if they just bench me after 2 years? Like, these are things that could happen. And Mark Few and the staff have to evaluate whether the risk of some of that stuff happening is worth the reward of adding a player like Caleb Love. When you consider that Caleb Love has caused issues on his teams in the past, not because of his personality, not because of who he is as a person, but because of his basketball playing style. When you factor that in, along with what it might do to the personnel on your team, there's risk here. There's definite risk here. Beyond that, Caleb Love, not a very good defensive player. I've maintained that this is Gonzaga's biggest issue. They were barely a top 75 defensive team in the country last year. And then this year they've added Ryan Nembhard, who's not a great defender, Steele Venters, who's not a great defender, Graham Ike, who's not a great defender. They haven't added to their they haven't made their team better on the defensive end of the floor. Caleb Love doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He's fine. He's a good athlete. He's not horrendous defensively, but he's not very good either. And so you add him into the mix, you get more scoring, great. You get more playmaking, all of that stuff, but you don't get better at probably the biggest issue on this Gonzaga roster, which is just overall defense. They lack rim protection, which of course Caleb Love's not going to bring. You're not worried about that, but they lack perimeter defense as well. And losing Rasir Bolton and Malachi Smith and Hunter Salas, for that matter, and replacing them with Ryan Nembhard and Steele Venters and Caleb Love, you do not get better defensively. In fact, you get worse. And then the final thing for Caleb Love, he's turnover prone. I think he would be in a role where he'd have the ball in his hands less at Gonzaga, which likely means his turnover issues wouldn't be as prevalent. But in 3 years at North Carolina, he averaged 3.3 assists and 2.7 turnovers. He's going to turn the ball over. At Gonzaga, it's probably going to be a smaller rate. Maybe it's 2.1 assists and 1.6 turnovers, something like that. But it's still an issue for Caleb Love that I don't imagine is going to just disappear at his next stop in college basketball. Well, we're going to close out today's show, closing out Memorial Day with discussion on Jerry Krause, who passed away at age 87 after having an immense impact on basketball in the Inland Northwest, coming up right after this. All right, segment 3. Happy Memorial Day to all of you out there here on the Locked On Zags podcast. We're going to close out the show today talking about Jerry Krause, who passed away over the weekend at age 87. Krause was the director of operations for the Gonzaga basketball programs from 2001 to 2015. He had a very, very profound impact on basketball in the Inland Northwest, is the best way to put it. He was much more than just his 14 years as director of ops for Gonzaga in the Inland Northwest. He was also the Eastern Washington head basketball coach from 1967 to 1985. His tenure at Eastern Washington led them from being an NAIA program to a Division II program. Of course, now they are a Division I program. They're probably not there without his impact, without what he did in that program. He single-handedly helped carry that program, the basketball team, to the success that they had, which helped rise the level of that program entirely. Krause is a member of the NABC Board of Directors and Rules Committee. He was involved in helping adopt the shot clock and the three-point line. Basically, modern basketball at the collegiate and NBA level. The people who made the decisions to change some of the biggest and most impactful rules in all of basketball, Jerry Krause was on that board. He was there. He had those conversations. Krause is a very, very illustrious author. He has written over 60 published works. Many of them are used still to this day, including his book, Basketball Skills and Drills, which was written in 1999 and is one of the most widely sold books on basketball fundamentals in the world. This man lived and breathed basketball. And the Inland Northwest was so fortunate to have him on their side. He was just recently elected into the College Basketball Hall of Fame this past year. That was a tremendous honor for him. I'm so happy that he got that inauguration. He got to be a part of that ceremony and those festivities before he passed away. It would have been so unfortunate for Krause to get that recognition, which he so obviously deserved, for it to happen after his passing. I'm very, very glad that that was not the case. Krause also had a profound impact on Gonzaga specifically, in part because he convinced Craig and Lisa Fortier in 2004 to join the Gonzaga program as graduate assistants. Lisa Fortier, of course, now the longtime head coach of the women's basketball program, one of, if not the second most successful women's basketball coach in Gonzaga history, and is well on her way to potentially passing Kelly Graves as number one. Craig Fortier, her husband, has been a longtime assistant coach with that program as well. They would not be here without Krause. Mark Few has talked glowingly. In fact, I'm going to read you a quote from Mark Few. This is from the press release that was published on Gonzaga's website about Krause's passing. And this is only a snippet of a much longer quote that Mark Few gave about Krause and his impact on the program. But he said this, quote, "I don't know if people realize this, but he was into analytics before really anybody else. We were analyzing our games much like the way we do now with his own system that really worked with our coaching styles. Jerry's impact on the game is why he was inducted in the College Basketball Hall of Fame, which was a really big deal to him, and it should be because that's a huge honor. Jerry was just a great friend to everybody who has ever been through Gonzaga, whether they played here, coached here, or just been around here. He always talked about having an attitude of gratitude, and I think he really exemplified that in his life." Wonderful quote from Mark Few, but I love that he talked about the analytics part of it, because Mark Few on paper and in some of his conversations when he gets interviewed by the press doesn't exactly seem like a super pro analytics guy, but they are. This program has been. They've been on the cutting edge of how to analyze players, how to bring in talent, how to identify talent in a way that is the reason that this program has made 23 consecutive NCAA tournaments, is the reason that a small school in Spokane, Washington can recruit players who outperformed their rankings, who made it to the NBA or made All-American teams when nobody expected them to. Players like Dan Dickau, like Kelly Olynyk, international stars like Domantas Sabonis, Roni Turioff. There are so many people to give credit for those players succeeding, including, of course, those players themselves. But Jerry Krause is on that list for his forward-thinking, cutting-edge ability to recognize different patterns in basketball and to analyze things in a different way, in a way that jived with the coaching staff. He picked players that he thought would play well for Mark Few and that were better than the rankings indicated, and he was right. And there's a reason that Gonzaga has been so dang successful. There's many reasons. Trust me, there's many reasons. Jerry Krause is among them. And while he hasn't been as involved with the program lately because of his health and because of his age, they would not be here without him. I always struggle with how to talk about death when it's, when it's somebody who passed away at an older age. And Mark Few kind of talked about that a little bit in the first part of his quote, where he said, he's sad, he feels sad, but what an incredible life that this man lived. lived. And I think that's the way to look at it. He accomplished so much. He made the Hall of Fame. He wrote 60 books. He helped lead a program from NAIA to Division II. He helped put Gonzaga on the map. He started here in 2001. Gonzaga was not on the map yet. So for him to have had that amount of success and accomplishment, and to really have brought it home to a community that he cared so much about, is just tremendous, beyond belief, beyond an ability to really comprehend how much he has done for basketball on the east side of the state of Washington. I'm going to close out the show here reading the last quote from Lisa Fortier, who, of course, has tremendous debt of gratitude to Mr. Krause for what he did for her. She says, Coach Krause taught me the value of teaching the game of basketball and focusing on details and fundamentals. There was always a life lesson wrapped into the conversations about our offensive or defensive efficiency. I am so grateful that he helped me and Craig get to Spokane as graduate assistants. He has made me a better person, teacher, and a better coach. The void doesn't seem like one that can be easily filled, but his legacy is one that will live on. And with that, we're going to close out the Memorial Day episode here of Locked On Zags podcast. We'll be back on Tuesday with more conversations about Anton Watson, about Malachi Smith, maybe some more about Caleb Love too, as we see more and more on what might happen with his recruitment. Don't forget to check out the show on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. You can also go subscribe to Locked On College Basketball. We did finally hit our 1,000 subscribers. I very much appreciate all of you who also went and checked out that show as well. More fantastic content coming your way later this week on Locked On Zags, available wherever you get your podcasts, available on YouTube as well. Thank you all for listening. Happy Memorial Day, and go Zags.